Welcome back to Antisocial Studies. Let's get right into it. Lincoln was elected in 1860 after saying he didn't think slavery should spread to any new territory. And then, from December, a month after the election, through June of the following year, 11 states seceded from the United States. South Carolina kicked it off, and were soon followed by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, basically the SEC. To be clear, the Civil War hadn't begun. There didn't have to be a war over the secession, and Lincoln's going to do everything he can to bring them back peacefully, but we know we're heading there, so let's just get to it. As part of their declaration of secession, the southern states demanded that the U.S. government give up all of its federal property, including military bases, that was located in those southern states. Now, Lincoln did not want to provoke a military conflict, but he also refused to just give up federal land and hand it over to them. In April, he decided to resupply the U.S. forces stationed at Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina, with food and basic supplies, no weapons or soldiers. Confederate forces fired on the federal garrison and forced it to lower the American flag and surrender. As U.S. troops evacuated the base, President Lincoln called on the militia to put down the insurrection, while at the same time 4 more states seceded: Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. Now the Civil War had begun. Before we get into the war itself, I want to spend some time diving into a few questions relating to secession, because it's one of those events that everyone just kind of breezes past without really stopping to think about what that means. 11 states just broke away from the United States, which begs the first question: can they do that? Well, just like Andrew Jackson, I guess they can, because they did. Since the US was created around 70 years earlier, people had disagreed on whether a state was allowed to leave the Union. Remember, the debate from the beginning was between a powerful federal government and a permanently united country, the Federalists and those who supported the Constitution. And on the other side were those who saw the U.S. as more of a loose collection of states, whose governments had the final say in most issues relating to people's lives. A lot of them, remember, were the ones who were happier under the Articles of Confederation, and it's no coincidence that the southern states decided to name their new nation the Confederate States of America. But there have been times in American history when states confronted the federal government over laws that they saw as unjust. Early on, many were appalled by John Adams's Alien and Sedition Acts, which made it harder for immigrants to become citizens and gave the president enormous power to deport dangerous immigrants and to restrict the speech of those critical of the federal government. In response, Kentucky and Virginia passed resolutions. They called them the Kentucky and Virginia Resolutions, and they argued that states could declare federal laws unconstitutional if they did not follow a strict interpretation of the Constitution. While this didn't actually change anything fundamental about the Constitution, it laid the foundation for the idea of states' rights. This idea came up again in the nullification crisis, mentioned a few episodes ago, and ironically, the states' rights argument was also used by northern states who opposed the harsh fugitive slave law. They cited the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions to argue that they didn't have to follow an unjust or unconstitutional law. Meanwhile, Kentucky and Virginia are like, wait, y'all can't use our resolutions to oppose slavery. That's not how that was supposed to work. But in fact, that's exactly how it works. You see, the first serious mention of secession in the 19th century was by abolitionists. William Lloyd Garrison, the newspaper editor, called for secession in his newspaper The Liberator in 1844, 15 years before South Carolina seceded. He argued that the Constitution was created at the expense of the colored population, and that it was unfair that Southerners were able to dominate politics through the Three-Fifths Compromise. The New England Anti-Slavery Convention actually voted to endorse the Principles of Disunion, 250 to 24. That's how bad things were. After public debate around slavery rose up again during and after the Mexican-American War, support for secession shifted toward the southern states. Both sides were like, you're not dumping me, I'm dumping you. Okay, the bigger question is, why did the southern states secede? And here's where I'm going to get myself into trouble. Because there's a lot of debate and discussion out there about the reasons for the Civil War. And there are a lot of people out there who like to point out that the Civil War wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights. I've been a teacher in Texas for 12 years. I've heard it all. And to those people, I would say, you're right. Whew. Curveball. Didn't expect that one, did you? I like to keep you on your toes. They're right that the Civil War was about states' rights. They just haven't finished the sentence yet. Because southern states definitively seceded over the issue of states' rights to enslave people. And if anyone out there wants to fight me on this, please don't. But also, please do your research first, because if you read the secession documents, in which the states clearly lay out their reasons for leaving the Union, there is no debate. It was about slavery. So every state in the Confederacy issued an article of secession declaring their break from the Union. But 4 states went even further. Texas, Mississippi, Georgia, and South Carolina all issued additional documents, usually referred to as the Declarations of Causes, which explain their decision to leave the Union. And let me just lay out the main points for you, but I've linked to these documents below for anyone out there who wants to fact check me. There are mentions of states' rights in the documents. They argue that the Union was a compact, but one that could be annulled if states were not satisfied with actions by other states in the Union or the federal government. And they argue that the northern states' reluctance to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 means that the Union is no longer satisfactory. So from the get-go, the entire justification for Southern states asserting their right to secede is based on their frustration with the lack of compliance with the Fugitive Slave Act. Keyword, slave. Now, let me just read to you some direct quotes from the 4 Declarations of Causes documents that detail why each state decided to leave the United States. From Georgia. The party of Lincoln, called the Republican Party, under its present name and organization, is of recent origin. It is admitted to be an anti-slavery party. While it attracts to itself by its creed the scattered advocates of exploded political heresies, of condemned theories in political economy, the advocates of commercial restrictions, of protection, of special privileges, of waste and corruption in the administration of government, anti-slavery is its mission and its purpose. By anti-slavery, it is made a power in the state. So Georgia is making it clear that the election of Lincoln as a candidate from an anti-slavery party was the inciting event that made them secede. South Carolina says something similar. A geographical line has been drawn across the Union, and all the states north of that line have united in the election of a man to the high office of President of the United States, whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. From my home state of Texas, this one's a doozy. In all the non-slave-holding states, the people have formed themselves into a great sectional party based upon an unnatural feeling of hostility to these southern states and their beneficent and patriarchal system of African slavery, proclaiming the debasing doctrine of equality of all men, irrespective of race or color, a doctrine at war with nature, in opposition to the experience of mankind, and in violation of the plainest revelations of divine law. Whew. So just to pause and clarify for a second how horrific this is, Texas is going a step further and saying they're not only pissed about the idea of possibly abolishing slavery, they're pissed about the general idea of equality. Texas, you make it so hard to be from you. And most plainly from Mississippi, quote, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world." Furthermore, when the Confederate States of America drafted its own constitution, it mostly copied and pasted from the US document, except to make a few noteworthy changes. For one, the Confederate Constitution actually mentioned slaves, unlike the US Constitution. One article banned any Confederate state from making slavery illegal, so the opposite of states' rights. Another article ensured that slave owners could travel across state lines with their enslaved people, and it required that any new territory acquired by the Confederacy had to allow slavery. Again, they're literally taking away a future state's right to decide for themselves because they want slavery everywhere. So were there other reasons that states wanted to leave the US? Yeah, sure, of course. Georgia took a shot at northern manufacturing interests that they felt were exploiting the South. Texas mentioned its dissatisfaction with federal military protection in its state. But anyone who reads these documents and studies history can see pretty quickly that the primary cause of secession was the issue of slavery. They were very clear and upfront about it at the time. Now, what is also true is that not every single Southerner who enlisted in the Confederate military was doing it to preserve slavery. Some of them wanted to defend their land or prove to their girlfriend that they were brave. Seriously. There's a letter from a woman telling her boyfriend that if he doesn't enlist, she'll send him a dress to wear. Problematic gender stereotypes aside, that's a pretty compelling reason for a man to go to war. And on the flip side, not all Northerners went to war to fight against slavery, especially considering that many of them were poor white people who could actually lose jobs and status to newly freed African Americans. So each individual soldier's motivations are his own. But at the state and federal level, the reason for going to war was clear. It was about slavery. Okay, one more secession-related question. Did all of the slave states secede? No. This is another argument that some people make to prove that the Civil War wasn't about slavery. If it was, wouldn't all of the slave states have seceded? No, because again, Lincoln didn't campaign on the promise to end slavery outright. He actually very clearly said that he did not want to take away state slaves that already existed. He just didn't want slavery to extend into new territory. So there were some states, those in the middle, who kind of took him at his word and stayed. These states were often more economically tied to Northern interests, mostly thanks to geography. The two slave states that never declared secession were Maryland and Delaware. And two others, Kentucky and Missouri, had pro-Confederate governments that ordered secession, but they were never really in control of the states. And West Virginia made up the fifth border state after it split from Virginia over the issue of secession. These border states especially epitomize the brother versus brother nature of the Civil War. About 170,000 border state men, including African Americans, fought in the Union, and 86,000 in the Confederate Army. Sometimes this meant that families had sons fighting on both sides of the war. And interestingly, every single slave state sent battalions of troops to fight on both sides of the war, except South Carolina. Whew, man, don't mess with South Carolina. They're pissed. But even though in every other Confederate state, there were units of men who fought for the North, the divide was the most dramatic in the border states. Okay, so 11 states seceded and formed the Confederacy. Within its new borders, there were 9 million people, and 1/3 of those people were enslaved. After a brief stint in Montgomery, the capital was set in Richmond, Virginia, and Jefferson Davis was chosen as the first, and spoiler alert, only president of the Confederacy. Born in 1808, Jefferson Davis was the son of a Revolutionary War veteran. Think about that. The Revolutionary era and the Civil War seem so far apart to me, but Jefferson Davis was born in 1808, and Abraham Lincoln was born in 1809. They were alive during the War of 1812. They were both born during Thomas Jefferson's presidency. I don't know why that blows my mind, but it does. Wait, that's probably why his parents named him Jefferson. A graduate of West Point, Jefferson Davis's career path bounced between Congress and the military, basically whenever a war was on. He led troops in the Mexican-American War, served as President Pierce's Secretary of War, and was a U.S. Senator from Mississippi when the state seceded. Davis summed up his views on slavery, quote, "We recognize the Negro as God, and God's book and God's laws in nature tell us to recognize him, our inferior, fitted expressly for servitude." Okay, I guess there's nothing left to do except fight a civil war. To be continued. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe and join patreon.com/antisocialstudies.